Okay, well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Dynamic Coalition on Core Internet Values meeting at this IGF in Istanbul. With us, we have a very, very illustrious panel that is joining us in this tiny room, but we'll have a very interesting discussion, hopefully. We'll start from the left, from my left, with Adam Peake from Glocom, representing the academic community. Next to him, we have David Cake from an organization called the Electronic Frontiers in Australia. Next to him is Dr. Steve Crocker, who is the chairman of the board of ICANN. Then we'll have Larry Strickling, who I think needs no introduction, but is the Assistant Secretary for Communication and Information at the US Department of Commerce. That's effectively the administrator of the NTIA, the National Telecommunication and Information Administration. Next, to my immediate left is Vint Cerf, Dr. Vint Cerf from Google, Chief Internet Evangelist. Then to my right is Baroness Rennie Fritchie from Nominet. We'll then have also Shiva Subramanian Muthuswamy, Desiree Milosevic. Sorry, Shiva was from the ISOC India Chennai chapter. Desiree Milosevic wearing a large number of hats, I believe Aphelios and whole ISOC as well, and a number of responsibilities. And finally, on my extreme right is Amy Stepanovic from Access Now. So I understand that the format of the session is going to just be, since we have so many panelists, about a 5-minute statement from each one of our panelists to describe really what their organizations are doing to support the cause of for preserving internet values. And preserving all those core internet values that help the internet bring all that innovation throughout those recent years. I think that Dr. Crocker needs to leave early, perhaps, so maybe we could start with you, and then we'll go through a way from the left over to the right. So, Steve Crocker, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Olivier. I seem to have been in error as to whether or not I had a competing obligation. Sort of reminiscent of I never make a mistake. I once thought I did, but I was wrong. So I plan to stay unless something urgent comes up here. On the preservation of core internet values and what our organization ICANN is doing, I want to flip back to a much earlier time, way before the formation of ICANN, and talk about openness in a particular way. When Vint and I and several others began to work on the ARPANET, we quite naturally, not by careful thought so much, but just because it felt right, created an environment, or part of an environment that got created, I should say, in which openness was very natural. And all of that led to the creation of the IETF eventually, the openness architecture of the internet. But when I look back, I realized that we actually built in 3 layers of openness into the process. We built an open architecture, which is a technical matter, and that made it possible for applications to be built by others who had not been there at the beginning and did not need to ask permission going forward. And that's brought us many, many things, Skype and eBay and Twitter and everything that good and bad, basically, that you want on the net, Facebook. But the other elements of openness were slightly more subtle. The initial set of documents that we created were distributed free of charge to everybody and have remained so continuously over the entire 45-year process. This has had a dramatic positive effect. It's made it possible for individuals anywhere in the world to download the documents, read them, and come up to speed, and also to participate in the ongoing processes of creating more. And the third kind of openness was the fact that all of the process of creating protocols are open. The IETF has no restrictions on membership. Anybody can join a mailing list, participate in a working group, and so forth. Many years ago, there were some statistics presented on the number of new people at each IETF meeting, and I recall that the number was a stunningly high 37%. So that's a very high ratio of new people coming to every meeting. The downside of that many new people is that there's a learning curve and a bit of an overhead to bring the people in. The upside is quite dramatic. It means that new people are entering, coming up to speed, and there is a vibrancy and refreshing process that's underway. So I use up my time with that and then bring forward to the organization that I'm now deeply enmeshed in, ICANN. And one of the questions that I think we want to look at ICANN is to what extent are in fact new people joining the process? How open is the process, not just in terms of our rules, but in terms of the way it actually plays out? And I think that's one of the areas that we want to attend to and give it some priority going forward.
Thank you very much, Steve. We're going to take questions at the end, so we'll bank all the questions and we'll move immediately to Adam Peake. With regards to the academic side of things, and I guess you've been also a member of the MAG, you've been involved in so many different parts, I think IGF Secretariat. You must have quite a full view of this whole internet ecosystem and where it's going.
I'm not so sure about that, but you mentioned academic, and usually I'm associated with civil society, but I do teach at a university and occasionally have to teach some MBA students, and it's a very small course. It's at a university in Japan that teaches it's about 80% non-Japanese students, so it's a quite interesting environment to do that in. And I begin that course by reading something that I'll read here, and that's not too boring, and you'll probably recognize who the original author is. And he's saying, and I'm talking to, I will try. So to go back, this is something that I introduced that course with, and it begins with the gentleman, and it's actually, it's Tim Berners-Lee. And he says, 27 years ago, the inventors of the internet, and he has a footnote pointing to you and Bob Kahn, designed an architecture, TCP/IP, which was very simple and general. Any computer could send a packet to any other computer. The network did not look inside the packets. It is the cleanness of that design, the strict independence of layers which allow the internet to grow and to be useful. And he talks on and goes on to say, when 17 years ago, and that is of course now 25 years ago, I designed the web, I did not have to ask anyone's permission. And interestingly there, he does say, I had to ask for port 90, so he had to go somewhere. The new application rolled out over the existing internet without modifying it. I tried then, and many people still work very hard today, to make the web technology, in turn, universal, neutral platform. It must not discriminate against particular hardware, software, underlying network, language, culture, disability, or against any particular type of data. Anyone can build a new application on the web without asking me or Vint Cerf. Asking me or Vint Cerf or their ISP or their cable company or their operating system provider or their government or their hardware vendor. And these are principles that I believe in and I think we're beginning to lose. And when I talk to the students, that's what we build the course around. What are we losing? What do you want to retain? And it's very difficult. We have different ecosystems with applications, app services, whether it's Google Play or whether it's the Apple Store and so on. And there's a whole range of issues around there. But in that, I think Berners-Lee encapsulates what I want to retain, which is the neutrality and this ability to innovate, to the ability for speech. And the thing that does interest me, when he's talking about permissionless innovation here, he does make reference to that need to ask for port 80. So we do have to recognize that there is critical internet resources, and that's where we come into all of those issues around ICANN and so on. So I found that a very useful sort of set of statement to begin trying to get these young MBA students thinking about what the internet was, is, and can be. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adam. Next is David Cake.
Thank you. So, Electronic Frontiers Australia is, we're one of a family of organisations that are not directly connected, the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the US being the largest, but there are a few others around, Electronic Frontiers Finland and so on. Yeah. We are civil society organisations, and we generally would describe ourselves as internet civil rights organisations. And we spend a lot of time pushing for values like anti-censorship, pro-privacy, other civil rights. But we're not purely defined as civil rights organisations. We not only are we specific to the internet, but and other sort of related communications technologies, but we specifically, in our charter, have as part of our goal to educate lawmakers about the internet. And I think the organisations, certainly at the time when the various electronic frontiers were founded, 20 years ago, my organisation is 20 years old this year, the lawmakers were quite ignorant of that world, and many of them still are. We still have to, so we see part of our role as actually to educate government about what the core internet values are. Now, the things that and why particular sorts of law or policy would be very inappropriate for the way the internet works, and governments often do not understand the deep differences between a national telco regime and the internet, which is a very, very different model. So sometimes those technical core internet values, like that we should, for example, that we should be that we do the complicated stuff at the edges, and the networks should simply pass along the bits. Sometimes that does become very relevant to policy, and that is the sort of way we can inform them. I'd like to hope that things like civil rights are not so much core internet values, but global values. But the interaction between the two can be a challenging area for many. And I think we do try hard to look at how the internet works and its values, and how those technical values and values of openness, the open processes that Steve talks about, can best be translated into the world of policy. That is sometimes complicated. The IETF famously has its maxim about we do not believe in kings, presidents, or voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. When you translate that in the policy arena, well, we can't ignore kings and presidents. They are very much there. But we can try and bring those values of working with rough consensus and proven practical solutions that come from people who are actually working in the internet world, and not simply theorizing about what should be, into the policy process. And of course we participate not only at our national level, but also at within ICANN and other organisations, particularly Electronic Frontiers. I personally the vice chair of the GNSO, or a vice chair of the GNSO at the moment. That is part of trying to support policy processes that carry on those ideals of openness and consensus that built the internet. And it's a difficult. The reason why we're all here is that translating those early values and processes into the world of global governance and policy is complicated. But it's, of course, part of the reason why so many of us are here is because it's very, very important to do so. And every organisation that is involved in that policy process, let's hope we can keep those internet values alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Next is going to be Larry Strickling.
Thank you, Olivier. And I just have to say at the outset, I feel totally inadequate sitting up here between two of my heroes, Vint Cerf and Steve Crocker. It's like, who doesn't belong in this picture?
We don't. I don't.
But as the government representative, I obviously, I think, want to focus my remarks on the role of governments in this process, and this debate that we've been having from the beginning in terms of whether governments ought to be controlling internet policy or whether we ought to continue, as we have, putting our faith in the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. And it's an important question. It's not a theoretical question because the evidence is quite clear that the governments that tend to support governmental control and regulation of the internet also tend to be the governments that are most likely to censor content in their own countries and otherwise act in what many of us believe are repressive manner. Freedom House has reported that I think of the countries at the Wicket in 2012 who supported more governmental regulation, 65% of them regularly engage in censoring content. So it's more than just a nice theoretical debate about are governments the right place to do this, or do we want to rely on the multi-stakeholder process, because there are actual consequences to the answer to that question. I think it goes without saying that the United States government has from the start promoted and sought the expansion of support for the multi-stakeholder process. Over the last 4.5 years, while I have been part of the government, we have worked hard to achieve this. David mentioned that there's originally thought that there shouldn't be a role for kings and presidents in this process, and in fact, if you go back and read the 1998 white paper from the Department of Commerce, the U.S. made that same assertion, that there was no role for governments to participate in the management of the domain name system. Of course, the importance of the internet, the growth of the internet has made that original premise just not a possibility any longer, but we still have the question of how to go about dealing with this conflict between governments that want to exercise multilateral control over these resources versus having the entire community do it. One of the things that we sought out early on in the United States government, and you see this through our work on the affirmation of commitments and the actual work of the accountability and transparency review teams, was that one of the issues governments had was they felt they couldn't have their issues heard in a fair way here at, or not here, but at ICANN. We're not at ICANN today.
But the same people, so it feels
yeah, I know, it feels that way. And so folks who have followed the Accountability and Transparency Review Team process know that in 2010, one of the series of recommendations was made by that team to do more to formalize and tighten up the process by which governments could give advice to the board. So on the one hand, a demand was made that if the governments want to be heard, they have to work on a consensus basis and deliver consensus advice to the board, because up until that time, advice to the board was quite diverse, and more importantly, it didn't reach conclusions. It was on some governments think this, other governments think that, and it went to the board, and what was the board supposed to do with that? So a very strong recommendation to put more discipline on the GAC to work toward consensus. But then, in return for that, when they reached consensus advice, we felt that there needed to be a more formal response from the board, which is envisioned in the bylaws. The bylaws make it clear that when there is consensus advice on a public policy matter from the GAC, the board needs to respond in a particular fashion. And so upon receiving consensus advice, it was important that the board have processes to deal with it. And to the board's credit, they stood up to that, and you saw through the entire debate on the expansion of GTLDs, a very engaged and formal process by which the board took, what was it, I think about 90 separate pieces of GAC advice and dealt with each one of them item by item in terms of either agreeing to it, negotiating it, working it out, and is now put in place what I think is a pretty good process going forward in terms of how to deal with this. So the idea that governments could still claim that they weren't being heard at the GAC or at ICANN, we felt was very much addressed in the first series of recommendations. We still have individual governments who complain about outcomes at ICANN. Certainly the reaction of a handful of European states to the .wine and .van situation reflects that, but there's no question that the process, I think, still worked in that regard, in that there was no ability for the GAC to reach consensus advice on these issues because these were fundamentally very complicated, very controversial issues for which there is not international unanimity or consensus as to how to deal with these issues of geographic indicators outside the domain name system, much less within it. So many of us feel that the system worked, but you still have countries complaining that they didn't feel they got a fair shake, and I think we will constantly have that. Now, I think as we move forward, our commitment to the multi-stakeholder process, I hope people feel, has been very concretely demonstrated by our announcement in March to transition out of our remaining role in terms of our stewardship of the IANA functions. And I do think that this is really putting our money where our mouth is in terms of the United States' support of the multi-stakeholder process. We're watching with great almost amusement as the community takes this on. I think it's a real test to the community of the multi-stakeholder model, and can they organize themselves? Can they focus on the important issues and get to consensus? I think upon the successful completion of this, and I do expect a successful completion, this process will be much stronger for what the community is going through right now as they try to wrestle with all of the different issues that are emerging about how broad the analysis has to be and how they go about bringing together all the different interests of ICANN in one place on what is perhaps the most fundamental question ICANN has had to face since its creation back in 1998. We need to use these examples of success when we go to places like the International Telecommunication Union, where we see these proposals from other governments to increase multilateral control over the internet. We need to continue to work country by country, and all of you as stakeholders need to work with your governments to impress upon them the importance of supporting the multi-stakeholder model. In that regard, the Netmundial conference in April, we think, was a tremendous step forward in terms of bringing especially countries from the developing world more into the ambit of the multi-stakeholder model, giving them a chance to observe it directly and to track their support for it. Certainly Brazil, I think, made tremendous progress in terms of hosting that and in terms of the principles that came out of that which they now enthusiastically support. So we need to continue to find ways to build on Netmundial, build on the Ilves report, work through the transition of the IANA functions to continue to build support and win this argument once and for all in terms of who should be controlling the internet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. And I recognize that Paul Wilson from APNIC has also joined us at the table. So that's a note for the transcriber, Paul Wilson. Now, right next to me is Vint Cerf. So Vint, you're next.
Well, thank you very much, Olivier. Good morning, everyone. We've already heard a reprise of the most important properties of the network that I care greatly about. And I guess I should say that I'm trying to represent multiple parties here. I am here as the chairman of ARIN, one of the 5 regional internet registries, and together we are the number resource organization, but I'm also here as a Google person. And that's an inescapable fact as well. So I'm going to try to respond to your question about what are my institutions doing to preserve the properties of the internet we deem to be important, and perhaps single out which properties these different institutions are working. Is that better? Should I attach it to my left nostril? So let me start out by mentioning how important low barriers to entry onto the internet are. In the absence of low barriers, this makes it very difficult to spread broadly. And the barriers could be economic, they could be technical, they could be policy barriers. And I think all of us are interested in keeping those barriers as low as possible. Google has been building high-speed fiber networks, and we plan to do so in 34 different cities around the United States, and trying to keep the costs low and the services high. Another thing that's super important is end-to-end connectivity. When you get attached to the internet, you should be able to reach any other termination point in the network. And one of the things that's needed for that is unique addressing, and the regional internet registries, Aaron included, are responsible for making sure that they do the allocation of addresses in a way that's unique to maintain this end-to-end connectivity. Another property of this architecture is loose coupling, and it's already been articulated that it's important that the internet protocol layer be able to sit on top of a wide range of different technologies. And just as Tim Berners-Lee said, the network, and in particular the internet protocol layer, doesn't know what the packets are carrying. In consequence, it opens up opportunities for an arbitrarily broad range of applications, since the network doesn't have to interpret the bits other than to get them delivered to the appropriate place. The Netmundial Principles have been widely lauded and, in some cases, adopted. I'm going to abstract from them some specific freedoms which I believe are fundamental to the utility of the network, and one of them is to preserve the ability of its participants to speak, to assemble, and to have access to the information which they collectively have produced and wish to share. But privacy turns out to be a very important concept, and we are hearing a great deal about that. But I'd like to also emphasize how important freedom from harm is in this environment. And we have to be honest that we are not free from harm in this internet space. And we have to take steps, technical steps and political steps and other kinds of practical steps to preserve people's safety in this environment. And that involves all the stakeholders. All of them have some shared responsibility for protecting the users of the internet from harm. Another thing which I think we have to take into account is that the network is what it is today because it actually has a commercial engine underneath it. In the absence of that commercial engine, you would not see anything like the wide distribution and penetration of the internet. The tension here is how to keep that economic engine going without harming all of the properties of the internet that we hold dear. And so this, too, is a big challenge. So I think, Mr. Chairman, that I'll stop there and eagerly await questions and comments from the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Vint. Next is Rennie.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to start by saying two things. First of all, if Larry feels he's between his heroes, I'm sitting at a table surrounded by enormously clever people steeped in this sector and this industry, and that's not my background. I'm chair of Nominet, and that's why I'm here, and I've been there 4 years. But my background is in governance. I was an ombudsman. I was a regulator of the government. I've chaired many boards. And so my first introduction to this world was when Tim Berners-Lee, who everyone knows so well, and I had got to know when I was chair of Council of Southampton University, asked me to chair the Web Science Research Initiative, which was the predecessor to the Web Foundation and then the Web Institute. And so one of the most challenging jobs in my life has been to chair a board with Tim Berners-Lee on it and try to make him pay attention to governance matters. I feel I should have a medal, but I certainly learned about some of the important things. And then I came to Nominet. So it's from that background that I talk to you. The second thing I wanted to say is when you're asked to speak or contribute to an event like this, you have no sense of the room, the ambiance, and all of those things, so you prepare for whatever. Since my background isn't so steeped, I haven't got headings that I can easily talk from. I've made notes, so I hope you'll bear with me if I broadly stick to my notes, because then I know I'll be saying sensible things. So thank you for that. Nominet is the operator of the .uk domain name registry, and we're also, just having got the new GTLD, we've also just launched .cymru and .wales, focused on a part of the UK that's officially bilingual. We've also been identified as an emergency back-end registry and providing support if it's needed to protect the internet should a user, should a GTLD fail. So I fully subscribe to the principles that we've heard about and read about, but I wanted to emphasize two other principles or values that I see as important, as enabling values to those that we've heard about. And these two are respect and responsibility. First, respect. To support our activities, Nominet has had to work with a clearly identified set of policies. It's important because clear policies, if we don't have them, then it's hard to be consistent and fair to everyone. And of course, to get there, we need to work closely with all our stakeholders to identify the issues and how these issues will affect different people in different ways. We know we're never going to get full agreement about the way forward, unless it's the simplest of cases. But what's important is that we recognize the impact that a particular approach might have on particular stakeholders. And wherever possible, we need to look to mitigate any harm that we might cause. That is, to respect the views of all stakeholders. We can so often be limited in views of stakeholders from any organization, putting them in a fixed box and describing them. That's those people. I came across a quote which helps me continually refocus on keeping an open mind, and it's this: "Don't underestimate me. I know more than I say, I think more than I speak, and I notice more than you realize." I think that's a really important sentiment when we're thinking about paying attention to people we must respect. I wasn't in Sao Paulo, but it's clear that one of the successes of Netmundial was this sense of respect between stakeholders. If we show respect to people, we then want to make an effort to understand their interests and their concerns, and we want to do it politely and thoughtfully and evidently. I mean, sometimes we'll agree to differ, but that's the heart of good policy making. I might not agree with you, but you have the right to make your point. Mutual respect suggests that we should all try to work together to find a way forward. Nominet has gone through quite a number of significant policy changes over the last few years, and it's also had to develop policies for the new Welsh community, the new TLD. And it's not always been easy to get there, and some of the decisions we've had to make have been quite difficult. However, by endeavoring to enter into a respectful dialogue with our stakeholders, I think we've found a useful framework that contributes to protecting internet users and a good framework for ensuring predictable and understandable decisions on behalf of the industry and the domain name registrants. We have a new registrar agreement where, as an industry, we can respond to criminal behavior, where the customer has a right to expect certain and clear standards of behavior. Internet users and domain name registrants and registrars and Nominet all benefit from this professional, respectful approach. My last enabling value is responsibility. This is something that goes to the heart of Nominet's ethos, that we want to make the internet a force for good. It also makes good business sense because we're promoting quality. Like or dislike the terminology self-regulation or multi-stakeholder engagement, both of these terms imply that all stakeholders have to step up to the plate, that we all have to take responsibility. And that's not always easy. It means thinking outside the box. A couple of examples from the UK. Responding to child abuse online, Nominet, along with nearly all ISPs in the UK and search engine and social media companies, is a member of the Internet Watch Foundation, an industry-led, multi-stakeholder initiative aimed at acting quickly to remove illegal content or make it difficult to access. We agree to respond to requests for action from the IWF. In addition to doing a good thing, the right thing, we benefit, as do all users of Nominet services, from a better reputation. Our new registrar agreement allows us to take action when we're alerted by recognized law enforcement agencies about criminal activities. We will check each domain name before taking action. In the case of child abuse, of course, we rely on the IGF, the expert agency, to make that decision. I could go on and will happily identify other policy areas where we've adopted the position of good citizen as part of our recognition that we need to behave responsibly and that we want to promote the culture of responsibility. What is clear to me, though, is that multi-stakeholder engagement is about partnerships. And partnership means that we must work together in the public interest, whether by providing technical services like the Emergency Backend Registry, or helping registries from developing countries make good policy decisions, or by making choices that help us protect our customers and citizens who visit .uk websites. By respecting our partners and making sure they have every reason to respect us, showing responsibility. We believe that we can show that the multi-stakeholder environment works. Self-regulation and the multi-stakeholder approach are not easy options, but we can show that if we adopt them with respect and responsibility, we can achieve more than a huge amount of regulation, and I speak as an ex-regulator. I'd like to end with a poem by Natasha Yosefovitz, which I think she took from Hillel, but it emphasizes our need to care and be responsible towards others. And she says this, the poem's called What Am I? Somewhere between always giving to others and always keeping to myself, I stand. Somehow between only caring for others and only caring for me, I live. But when I'm only for others, I ask, who will be for me? And when I'm only for me, then what am I? We must therefore, I think, be both respectful and responsible in our working together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rennie. Next we have Desiree.
Thank you, Olivier, and thank you for invitation to be on this superstar panel. So it feels like rubbing corners of the table with the giants. So I can only but thank you all, Crocker and Vint and everyone else who was involved in the development of the core internet and technical values that is the real inspiration, but not only inspiration, it is the real foundation of for the further societal development and the core values that already been mentioned, such as permissionless innovation, the open end, the openness of the architecture, the openness of the processes, and the end-to-end principle where you can deliver packets without any discrimination, be it political and commercial, are all important core values. But in addition to those, as well as openness and participation in the processes, something that the technical community institutions have been practiced for more than a decade. I think I agree with what's been said earlier with Dave, actually, that our task today is really to maintain that openness and to see how we can translate those core values into the public policy making. But I'd also like to add another core value, which I think is very easy to maybe forget, and that is trust that existed and that has been built initially, and we can also thank and recognize persons like John Postel. So I'm not talking just about the trust in the technical community and their competence to run the network, but I'm also speaking about personal and interpersonal trust that existed in the early academic community that built the networks and maintained the networks. And also, I think the institutional trust is our next step where we need to think how we can really best deliver that. Because what it is about building lasting cultural institutional bonds with the internet communities around the world. And John Postel did an excellent job in doing that. And I think we have a lot to learn. So I'd say that this is also one of the biggest developments that needs to happen in the internet. It's no longer a technology. It is really the ethics and the norms that we need to develop for the internet, and I believe that's why we're all here. I'm, say, maybe just one word with wearing an ISOC or the Internet Society hat. The Internet Society is the home organization of the Internet Engineering Task Force, and we heard from Steve about the openness of creation of the standards and the importance of allowing everyone to participate in those processes and the inclusiveness of that openness as well. And I think we're also trying to replicate on the level of equal footing and consulting all the interested parties when it comes to public policy making and in the international fora as well. So the building of these long-lasting relationships between institutions and their participants could really effectively moderate conflict and create the basis for future trust. The Internet Society could be also an example of the openness of its governance processes, because I think it should be also could serve an example how their board of trustees, for example, is elected. It has a huge representation of chapters around the world, more than 90 chapters that work today can be represented on the board of Internet Society. So there's this trusteeship theme that and the which is stems out of the word trust. I think it's just a new notion that needs to be a little bit looked in and dived in, looked in more deeply. So I'll leave it at that point, and so we can have further discussion.
Thanks very much, Desiree. Next is Amy.
Hi. Thank you very much, and I feel a little bit, I think as Desiree said, in a room full of giants. I'm Amy Stepanovich. I am a senior policy counsel with a group called Access, and I actually think it's very interesting to talk about the way preserving the way the internet is today. And really built into Access's mission statement is not only to defend international human rights in a digital community, but to extend those rights. So we, as an organization, not only looking at preserving the internet as it is today, but actually how to advance the internet and advance core internet values and human rights for the future and what that looks like. So I think we have a little bit of a bigger mission, and maybe we're in over our heads in that. So Access works under three main issue areas, trying to bridge the gap between advocacy, policy, and technology. We have a very, very dynamic technology team that runs a 24/7 digital security helpline. And that helpline work actually feeds directly into our policy work and how we set our policy goals and what we work toward. One of those major policy projects that we've been working on for the last year, actually almost exactly the last year, we're about to celebrate the anniversary, is the International Principles on the Application of Human Rights to Communication Surveillance. That is, in fact, the whole title. I know it's a mouthful, but these are what we're looking at, these human rights principles as the core values of the internet in our work. We look at how you take traditional human rights considerations and apply those to digital communities. And we came up with these 13 principles. And we work on them in very, very different means to try to perpetuate those throughout the entire grounding of the internet. So we believe that these should be the undercurrent from governance to law enforcement, through technology, through economy online, that these should be kind of what everything is built upon. So the funny thing is when people start talking about how to balance social values like privacy, like freedom of expression, with the economy and with the need for surveillance, we actually think that you're not balancing them, that everything that you do should be kind of grounded in principles of human rights, and then you build up from there from a user perspective. And so a few projects that we have been working on to perpetuate this, we actually at IGF this year have launched a website called mlat.info. That website actually maps every single existing agreement between different countries to transfer transfer our data back and forth between governments and corporations. And we have a great map where you can look at all of these different agreements and see how they relate to one another and under where the gaps are, which we think is very interesting because there is an official process. And we're trying to highlight the need to reform that process by showing where it's not working. We also are working on an implementation guide for the principles because we think that talking about values and talking about human rights isn't enough. You have to look at how to apply them in very specific situations. What happens when a law enforcement officer goes to a judge to ask for information about an individual? What should that process look like? So we're trying to take these very broad notions and really drill them down into a specific set of steps. Also on the idea of application, we've launched earlier this year a project called Encrypt All the Things. This is 7 steps that we consulted with a broad range of technologists, and we thought that if we put forward kind of a baseline level of what companies should be doing to protect user information on the internet, that we could almost peer pressure other companies into raising the bar on what they're doing to protect user data. So cybersecurity by the majority, basically, and how to protect user information online. So these are our 7 basic steps that we think need to be done. These are not exhaustive. They're not by any means, putting them into place is not going to protect everything, but we think it's a good start so we can stop getting information from being stored in plain text. We can stop kind of really bad security practices from happening and move toward a more secure internet that protects your rights through technology. And finally, in a couple weeks, we're participating in a week of action in order to highlight the principles and highlight how governments around the world are applying human rights and digital rights to the internet and how governments and users are interacting. And so we are recognizing leaders around the world, and if anybody has an idea on this, I'm taking suggestions, who have really kind of epitomized and worked toward recognition of human rights principles on the internet. And we're trying to give recognition not only to the people who have worked positively in that direction, but almost also a shaming campaign against people who have hurt the idea of internet rights, the idea of digital rights, and making sure that we're highlighting those people as well and saying that this is not the direction we should be moving in. We need to go the other way.
Thank you very much, Amy. Next we have Paul Wilson. Paul, you weren't here at the beginning. The question was what your organization, what each of our panelists' organization was doing to support the cause of preserving the internet core values.
Thanks very much, and sorry to be late. Sorry also to insert myself in the queue here, but I guess I've been passed the baton. I'm from APNIC, which is the Regional Internet Address Registry for the Asia Pacific, so we're a member of the technical community, so-called. And I guess as I came in, I heard David Cake talking, and I tend to agree with him, not because he's an Australian. I tend to agree with fewer and fewer Australians these days, so it's nice. But the distinction between technical internet principles and sort of wider principles, which aren't really, I think you could argue that they're not intrinsic to the internet itself. I don't want to draw a line on that, and certainly don't want to exclude any discussion of principles, but in terms of upholding technical principles that I'm going to talk about, I think we've got I've got enough work to do. I think the technical community has got enough work to do, and quite some challenging work to do. What defines the internet are features which are actually now so obvious and so ubiquitous that we really not only risk taking them for granted, we do take them for granted. The internet happens to be a global point-to-point, end-to-end network, as Vint said. It happens to be a network that is neutral by default, that has the loose coupling that Vint also mentioned. It's a network that's based on free and open standards at the technical level. It's a network that, through its simplicity, has provided a very low barrier to entry. And behind each of these principles are technical features which really, you might think they come for free with the internet, but there are all sorts of ways in which they could be eroded. And the sort of thing we need to think about is to what extent would we actually notice in 10 years' time with the erosion of some of these principles? I mean, the principles that we're talking about create the internet and the internet environment that supports permissionless evolution and innovation, that supports a very low and ever lower barrier to entry and cost for users. It's a little bit hard to know how, if 10 years down the track we had started to lose those things like innovation, how would we even know? And I think what we need to do to avoid that situation is really to understand what they are and why they're here and what it takes to support those principles. Some of them actually are a little surprising. I mean, one of the features of the internet is that at the network layer, it really is what people have often rudely referred to as a dumb network. It does not have very much happening at the network layer at all. It's lean and mean, if you like. But that is absolutely a feature and not a detriment. It's part of the vision that was involved with creating it. Likewise, it is not a secure network at that level either. And some people might say, well, it should be. And I agree, encrypt everything is a fantastic principle, but you don't want to have it happen at the internet layer. I mean, if you imagine what might happen if we had a single monolithic encryption system underlying the internet, what that would mean in terms of technology and policy and access and risks and authority, it doesn't even bear thinking about. But so the internet being a dumb and insecure network at the IP layer is absolutely a feature, and these reflect principles that need to be actually appreciated and preserved. Now, what are we doing? The IP addressing community is the community of organisations that I am a part of, other registries that provide addresses to the IP address users who are primarily network operators. And those network operators are generally commercial organisations who are participating in an open and bottom-up manner to determine the policies under which IP addresses are being managed. And I don't think you'd find that we have a set of strict principles behind the policy development process or the community processes, but I think the interesting thing is that the principles that I've mentioned are kind of observed by default. They're also supported actively in the mutual interest. The global point-to-point nature of the internet is something that's preserved at considerable cost as the internet grows, and it's at cost to the ISPs, who could allow a sort of fragmentation, who could permit and cooperate for a sort of fragmentation that would actually create more efficient routing and switching and management for them. But on the other hand, you know, what we actually are doing is preserving the routability of the internet as it exists, as it grows, and as it has so many more participants, adding to the challenge of maintaining that. And I think when we talk about fragmentation, as we have done in this conference, there's fragmentation at different levels, but the fragmentation at the technical level is one of these, and the avoidance of fragmentation through maintaining the end-to-end internet model is one of these sort of very specific technical principles that I think does deserve to be recognised. The maintenance of and sustenance of the growth of the internet, or the thing that we call the internet, doesn't actually require IPv6, because if we don't deploy IPv6, then the thing that we call the internet will keep being called the internet, but as I said, it will no longer be the internet 10 years down the track that we actually take for granted today. So I mean, that's a long way around saying that IPv6 is actually essential to maintaining not something called the internet, but the internet and its technical features, because you do not actually maintain the end-to-end and unfragmented model of the internet unless every point on the internet, every device, can be addressed individually. We're actually at a stage now where over the last 10 years this has started to be lost, and that is at considerable cost of expense and management overhead to network service providers. The beauty, the magic of IPv6 will be, and this is something that the addressing community supports very strongly, it will be to restore that end-to-end model in such a way that it can not only be restored but also maintained and sustained through a very long future of internet growth. So these sort of technical aspects are definitely not all there is to maintaining the functional aspects of the internet. So the low barriers to entry actually do come from commercial concerns, commercial policies, and also from, for instance, competition policies which governments maintain. And these, so I'm not trying to say that technical community is sitting here alone, sort of preserving these things. And the interesting thing, I think, is in fact that there's been a virtuous cycle of the internet having enabled a lower barrier to entry that is further enabled by further deregulation. So having been fed from I think an ethic of liberalisation in many parts of the world, it has also demonstrated absolutely the value of that, and also fed through offering this highly competitive environment as fed through to support and to encourage it further. But I'll just end on one sort of clash of cultures, which I think we all see in some respects. Okay, just finally, I think there's a sort of clash of cultures which I'd like to refer to here, which has to do with, what are our assumptions about how the internet should be, or about the decisions that may need to be made. And it came from a question I received from a government bureaucrat some time ago, who said, "What is it about IPv6? Who's in charge? When's it happening?" And I went through a long explanation of the distributed nature of the internet, the fact that there is no central point of control, that there are individual requirements which are being met by individual participants autonomously according to their own priorities, their own decision-making process. And I went through quite a long explanation. And he said, "Yes, it's very important, isn't it?" And I said, yes, it is." He said, "Someone should be in charge." And I think, that's where...
Did you volunteer?
He wasn't thinking of me, or any of us, actually. But yeah, I just think that there are, coming back to what David started to say this morning about kings and presidents and voting, we can point right back to some very early and quite intentional sort of ethics that are a little beyond the pure technical, but they actually are absolutely sort of cross-cutting through everything that's happened on the internet, sustained its success today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. And so finally we have Shiva, who is going to... Can you just make it a little bit short, please, because we are a little bit over time, and I'd like to have a dialogue with the room here. So, Shiva.
Okay, I'm Siva Subramanian from Internet Society India, Chennai, and I want to agree with Amy, who said that there is a room full of giants, and I want to thank the giants for honoring this coalition by setting aside their time, first of all. And I'm going to briefly talk about how we as an Internet Society chapter work for the good of the internet in general, which would in a way indicate what all Internet Society chapters largely believe in. As a chapter that does not collect any subscription nor inclined to raise funds, we have limited resources, and with very limited resources, our focus has been global rather than local. And we participated in global policy than in local programs. We've done this by organizing workshops at the IGFs, by providing inputs to the IGF review processes, inputs to IANA, ICANN, and ISOC, all in tune with the idea that the internet, open architecture of the internet must be preserved. We have always placed an unwavering emphasis on core internet values above local and national considerations. We have stood apart from our own civil society colleagues, expressed views that varied from that of our national government, and took positions that are in tune with the internet community. This has not been easy. This is not well understood at the national level, but our belief is that a global, free and open internet would cause worldwide economic and social development, which in turn is good for our country. So the smartest way to work for India is to work to preserve the internet as an open, free, global ecosystem with its environment of permissionless innovation. So in tune with core internet values, our Internet Society chapter is exploring the possibilities of establishing an internet exchange point at Chennai to supplement the good work that is already being done by NIXI, National Internet Exchange of India. Our proposal is to establish a neutral internet exchange. The idea is to have no more than a simple switch. And the simplicity is to be achieved to the extent feasible, not to have any equipment in the exchange that would interfere with core internet values. I hope we'll have ample support from our government. We are also working on a meeting to explore a model of expanded accountability for internet governance. This idea came from some of our members. This is with the idea that internet governance is a very broad area, that the Okay.
We also turned the other mic off. Thank you.
The idea that came from our chapter is that internet governance is a very broad area, that accountability framework could be larger and much stronger than the corporate style of accountability frameworks. I wish to draw an analogy from the business world. There are two different approaches to certifying the quality of a product or service. One is to subject the product to various tests, such as a drop test or an immersion test, and certify the quality of the product. Another one is the ISO 9000 style of certification, whereby an entire organization is strengthened for quality processes and for a propensity to turn out quality products. So if that kind of exercise to strengthen the framework is undertaken, then smaller questions get dropped as to a balance and regional balance in a board, or going into minute details about why a particular decision was taken, and the overall trust in the organization is built in, that if something comes out of ICANN or from ISOC, it must be a good decision. So this is what we want to explore academically. And still okay.
The transcriber is sweating away at the back of the room.
All right, and so this is just an idea that we want to work on, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask the largest contributor to internet governance, VeriSign, who is here, for some funding. As a chapter, I would request $100 as startup funds to flag off a discussion at our chapter level, and I would also like to invite Chuck Gomez to come and take part, and this is something that we would like to do. And so in general, whatever it is that we have been doing as a chapter has been in tune with what the internet community has been doing, is in tune with the internet core values. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shiva. And I think Chuck is reaching into his pocket at the moment to finding another chewing gum that he might be able to find as a starting point to the $100. Now, I think we're going to open the floor for questions. And so I see the gentleman on the right and the gentleman on the left. So let's start with you, sir. And could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Mike Godwin, and I've played different roles in internet culture at various times. When I was general counsel for the Wikimedia Foundation, we encountered we had a little difficulty with the Internet Watch Foundation, and the reason we did was that we had reproduced an image of an album cover that was sold in the 1980s. That the Internet Watch Foundation determined, based on its mysterious internal deliberations, was qualified as child pornography. And at that point, all Wikipedia content was routed through a proxy server in the United Kingdom that made it impossible for Wikipedia to enable United Kingdom citizens to edit content on Wikipedia, because in order for us to maintain the ecosystem in Wikipedia, we actually need to be able to identify users not by name, but certainly we have to identify IP addresses. And we knew that because of the proxy server, that functionality had been eliminated. Well, very quickly, Wikipedia users contacted Wikimedia Foundation. They contacted me personally and said, "What's up? We can't edit anymore from England." And I contacted, we quickly determined that the Internet Watch Foundation had in fact routed us all through a proxy server. And I contacted the Internet Watch Foundation, and they said, so you can appeal this decision. And I said, okay, well, I want to appeal it. Tell me what the process is. And the next email from the Internet Watch Foundation was, we've considered your appeal and it's denied. So then, of course, I was put in the always entertaining position of having to publicly shame the Internet Watch Foundation for having done this with no accountability. They engaged in censorship, effectively, with no accountability, no real formal due process or appeal. And to me, so it's always odd when I hear the Internet Watch Foundation advanced as a kind of paragon of shared values on the internet, when in fact it's difficult, closed, and mysterious, and there's nothing like the due process guarantees one expects of an institution that's hosted in a democratic government, in a democratic country. So I put that out there because I think that there is a core value of internet governance. There is a core value of internet functionality that has to do with openness, transparency, accountability, correctability, and I put it out there, and I'm happy to have you respond to this, or anyone respond to this, that the Internet Watch Foundation does not meet those criteria.
Thank you, Mike. So we'll have Rennie and we'll have Adam as well. Rennie.
Thank you. Could I just ask how long ago it was this happened?
This occurred on the 5th of December, 2008.
2008, okay. So I fully understand you had a really difficult situation, and that not only you had a really difficult situation, but that getting it sorted out was also in itself difficult. But I'm not the Internet Watch Foundation. We do contribute funds to the Internet Foundation, and I do know that over time they have learned from different ways of doing things, and therefore I know that the chief exec is here, and I had a meeting with her only yesterday, and she was talking about how they had evolved and what they'd learned. So I can only hope, since I'm not responsible for them, that some of the learning that came from your unfortunate experience is something that's helping make a difference so it doesn't happen to anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam?
Yeah, I remember the case, and I might even have owned the album a long, long time ago. Embarrassingly rubbish it was. Anyway, but it's very similar to ICANN and the issues we look at with transparency and accountability. We're holding ICANN to some very strict standards, and we should also be looking at other organizations of power and influence on the internet to do the same thing. I remember some years ago, Glocom, the organization I worked for, almost got caught in a spam blacklist. We had no idea that we didn't really, we are, a think tank that works on internet, but on policy issues and social matters, and we didn't really know how we were running our network, and we could have been blacklisted very easily. And there's some very powerful organizations out there, and if you were on a blacklist, it's almost impossible to get off again. I mean, things are much better now, but there are things that we can think of in terms of applying transparency and accountability rules across many of these organizations. And ICANN is doing a great job because it's showing us how to do it in many ways, and we can take some of these Netmundial principles and try and apply them, and perhaps that's something that this coalition is being established to think of and to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Next question is from Alejandro Pesanti.
Thank you, Olivier. I have a several comments here. First is on the dynamic collision itself. This is the workshop of the dynamic collision, but we still have to have a point of order for a meeting of dynamic collision, internal, procedural, etc. Stuff. So I hope that time management has allowed for that, or will set aside a slot for the participants of the dynamic coalition itself. The focus of the dynamic coalition has been on what can bring down internet principles, or let's say what can undo the internet by touching the principles, even with on the basis of goodwill, things like governments or demands based on rights that are not attuned, that have not as well considered not only the openness but several other important principles like interoperability. Sorry, I'm going to be slower. My mother was an interpreter, so I have to remember that. These demands, for example, based on the law or on rights, may cause blocking of content in certain countries, forbid certain conducts in specific sectors or geographies. And these things can be done in different ways, and some of those ways can actually go against the interoperability or the universal accessibility of every point on the internet and so forth. Going to specific comments made on the panel, Vint in particular has made one that we have been discussing separately, which is about the freedom of harm. And I think this is something that needs a really serious rethink in the context of the internet. Freedom of harm is a nice euphemistic way, and also to put it into a list of freedoms of speaking about security, about one specific or set of definitions of security, like personal security. And now we know that cyber security, let's say the personal security in cyberspace can translate into risks to personal security in mid-space. So we have to think really deeply about this. Before the internet, this freedom of harm was a primary function of the state. It is the state who has, to use the classical definition, the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical violence. And that monopoly is supposed in the social contract to mean that the state will only apply it wisely and opportunely and within the rule of law, and to protect citizens from harm. This protection from harm has been a function of the state then, and now we have to recast it, we have to rethink it, so that the states can continue, the Westphalian states can continue to function in that way. They can be the leviathans, or they can be much lighter than that, but we need much more than that, and all stakeholders must work and contribute on this. This leads also to the question of where this happens. Where this happens in mid-space before the internet is in the public sphere. It's in the public space. And the public space on the internet is privately owned. And there is essentially no piece of public space on the internet that is really public. And even then, when it's public, it is public within one country, because it's a website and a network that are run by the state or delegated to an institution by the state. Otherwise, wherever we meet, wherever we speak, wherever we organize, because free speech is only a precondition to change if it serves to freedom of association. This is, again, a question of core values of the internet. If you don't have openness, and if you have a company that owns the space that can decide that this picture doesn't go up, or this conversation and this organization to meet cannot happen, then you are not guaranteeing even that. There has to be a covenant, not necessarily a Magna Carta. I think that the Magna Carta is maybe too much of a concept, in the sense that it will create artificial stuff where we already have rights, well-defined rights outside the internet, to preserve this public space. It's not only openness, which has been the principal subject of this conversation, but also interoperability, scalability, robustness in the sense of resilience to changing variables, but also postel robustness in things like, do the most with the least that you get in communications. Seamless end-to-end. These are values that are also at risk. Even if right now end-to-end is actually a simulation. We do have end-to-end reachability of all of all points, but it's mediated by MPLS, by internationalized domain names, by DNSSEC, by content distribution networks. The complexity below is very high, and citizens demanding network neutrality, for example, are actually asking for a simulation of that behavior by the ISP. So these things have to be put always in projection against the core values that we're speaking about. These, in turn, I'm in my almost at the end. Human, corporate, and governmental conduct, things like putting children at risk, putting personal or commercial or state secrets at risk, etc., have to be addressed where their locus actually is, which is the law and social practice. Trying to implement child protection on the internet, like has been mentioned already by Mike Godwin, can actually spill over in very nasty ways on the internet. And you are putting a lot of effort into making it difficult for child abuse images to transit the internet. And that's okay, as long as you are also putting a huge social effort in impeding the existence of these images and their commercial use to sell sex and child abuse commercially to humans, which happens under the noses of regular law enforcement. That's where the crime actually happens, not on the internet. The internet is an adjutant. So we have to focus on these core values, that the internet is the network and it's a transit for human, corporate, and governmental conduct. To ISOC chapters, I would add that most ISOC chapters focus both on the local and the global, intervene in policy, and are very much fed by these concerns about the core values. So that will be that.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. That's a huge number of additional values, and certainly makes the whole topic particularly complex.
That's what we've been speaking in every session every yearly session of the
You're
Dynamic
absolutely
Coalition.
right. Yeah, Vint wanted to respond or react, and of course invite other panel members to react to the various comments that were made, and then we'll go to remote participation.
Olivier, a point of information. Yes. Mike Godwin here is the author of Godwin's Law, if you know about that.
Correct. Yeah.
So thank you, Olivier. I just wanted to draw attention to the interesting problem of defining harm. And it's not that I'm going to suggest that we need some dictionary definition. The problem is that harms that occur in the internet originate in one jurisdiction and sometimes terminate in another, the victims and the perpetrators in different jurisdictions. The social contract that we make with our governments that says, I will constrain my behavior in exchange for protection from some kind of harm, has to be understood in the context of who decides what is a harm and what is to be done about preventing it. In the internet environment, we are probably going to have to work very hard to come to consensus about what's harm and what to do about it. It will probably lead to not only multi-stakeholder, but possibly also multilateral agreements about actions to be taken upon the identification of harm. So I don't want to go on and on about this. It's a complicated topic, but we have to address this.
Thank you, Vint. Anyone else in our panel? Shiva.
It's a question to Larry and the other panelists from America, actually. And
Shiva, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was going to ask any response to Alejandro's, because I was going to go to the remote participants and then come back to you if you wish. Remote participation, I believe we have comments or questions.
Reply, Mr. Stefanovic comments, thank you for the excellent map that your organization creates. The basic principles you enumerate are very useful here in Bangladesh. However, I wonder if these principles are not too simplistic. When we encounter a bomb threat and our law enforcement want to track this down online, it is very difficult to explain why privacy or encryption is so important. It would be useful to provide more nuanced advice rather than the black and white principles that are being proposed. The blade of grass survives a storm better than the mighty oak. Reply, Mr. Siva's proposal. The ground reality is that the large ICPs do not announce their routes at the Nation Internet Exchange of India. Why would a new exchange work when a government-funded organization has failed? Reply, Dr. Wilson's comments. We heard that there is a well-funded initiative called Cryptech that intends to encrypt everything at the network layer. Isn't that the opposite of what you say is a bad idea?
Okay, thank you. Quite a few questions here. I've noticed one of them mentioned privacy, tracking, law enforcement, encryption. Quite a few things that don't appear compatible with each other. Any comments? So, okay. So let's first have the lady next to Alejandro Pesanti. If you could introduce yourself, including your affiliation, please. Microphone.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. My name is Marta Giraldo. I come from Colombia. Actually, I'm on the civil society part, but my background was I used to be director for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for modernizing the libraries in my country, and also I was the director of the Advanced Academic Network over the Internet, the Internet 2 in the United States, or GIANT, or CLARA in Latin America. I was director of Renata. And my consideration right now, and that's why I'm on the civil society position right now, because there's not an institution in my country that is really taking care about access to information for people. I mean, all this infrastructure and what is really the proposal of the country for giving to the municipalities, to the people less privileged, what is the content they are going to really help them in order for having something that really helps for the development of people. So my question is that, and for this in terms of the internet values, I would really call for the representativeness, because I really think that the civil society, the less privileged, are not really well represented here in terms of what they are really needing of the internet, which I would say are really contents that will help them to address their real needs. So access to information is my job, my bandera, I would say, the thing I'm looking for, but I really haven't find that place here to really express all this. There's not really meetings around that. IFLA invited me because IFLA is really pushing that access to information is one of the post-2015 development goals, and we're working on that, but I really want to say that I haven't found the place to talk about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any comments on this? In response. Okay, Shiva.
There was a question from remote participation that went like this. Why would a new internet exchange succeed when a government-funded exchange failed? Well, in India, the National Internet Exchange of India is a very successful internet exchange, which is run very well by government, and we have no second opinion on that. It is only for geographical reasons that the Chennai chapter wants to start an initiative to create an internet exchange, which would draw lessons from the National Internet Exchange of India, take a lot of support from National Internet Exchange of India, but still would remain as a neutral exchange. So that was my point. And if you would allow me to ask that question that I wanted to ask, or will you give me an opportunity later?
No, Vince still wanted to respond. Vince.
This is just a, by the way, you have another hand up over here. Just on the civil society side, this has always been quite a challenge, because finding out what civil society is thinking is difficult when there are potential 7 billion members of that rubric. Interestingly enough, in the context of the Internet Governance Forum, the presence of national and regional Internet Governance Forum meetings may actually open up more opportunity for dialogue to assemble and then push upward to the annual meeting. a better sense of what civil society wants, needs, and is concerned about. So it's not a perfect solution, but we really need to find a way to open that channel.
Thank you, Vint. And David Cake had to add something.
Right. This is perhaps a response to some of the, as I think one of the things Alejandro said. It very much seems that there are some civil rights and human rights with which the internet seems to be sort of intrinsically compatible. Organisations like my own are very much in favour of the internet because it seems like rights like free expression and freedom of association, it seems easier to provide these on the internet and very hard to stop them. And not to say that, some major governments and so on have not tried to, control freedom of expression on the internet, but it requires a great deal of effort where it requires virtually none to, it is the default. But it's important to understand that, yes, there are other rights and legal rights, civil rights, human rights that the internet does not seem easily compatible with it. And rather than sort of ignore them, I think we have to go back to that next level and say they're not just core internet principles that can be translated into the sort of policy realm, but we also need to look at the core internet principles of how we develop policy or how we develop things. We need to go back to our multi-stakeholder models and our open discussion and all of the other open discussion. And what we will discover, certainly some of these make compatibility of the internet with some particular rights. The right to be forgotten is the one that, and so on is one of the current topics, appears very difficult. I'm sure that, there are sort of giants among us like Steve and Vint who have veterans of literally decades of the IGF will tell us that some things that appeared to be very difficult way back then are routine now. That very difficult, there were long discussions about how to do something and it happened. Hopefully we will be able to address some of these if we sit down and have an open dialogue that really seriously includes not, as said in that ITF principle of this has to be practical and doable. Hopefully we will be able to find the way to make them compatibility, even if it's not obvious now. That's really all we can try to do.
Thank you, David. Rennie was just going to mention something quickly in response, and then Paul Wilson, then Shiva, and we are running out of time, so we'll have to just be short in your answers.
I'm making the offer on behalf of Olivier and I, because we're both involved in the UK IGF, and I have heard what you've had to say, and I'll take back to our organising committee your words about civil society and what we can do. So we'll do our bit. That's a promise. Thank you.
Vint, another short response then on the right to be forgotten.
You can try to do it a number of different ways. It's the right to be forgotten, and you can also do it wrong. Trying to use the search engines as a way to forget things is very tricky because we have to remember everything we're supposed to forget in order to remember to remove it from the index. And it gets worse over time because you have to keep remembering things in case they come back so you can remove them again. So that's not the right place to do it, but we're trying at Google and we're reporting the difficulties we're encountering with that.
Thank you, Vint. Paul Wilson.
I was asked a question in follow-up to something I said earlier about encryption of the infrastructure, and I am aware of the Encrypt Everything policy, which is very useful to avoid encryption itself being a indicator of a secret or sensitive correspondence. And the point is that if you make a habit of encryption, then the task of working out what to decrypt, an expensive task in itself, becomes much greater. And I'm sure there's many other discussions about this. So I think at the user level, Encrypt Everything is great, but what I tried to say before was that if anyone offers you a universally encrypted internet infrastructure with a monolithic inbuilt encryption by default, I would be rather suspicious about that. That said, there could be standards and a whole range of discussions that I'm actually not up to date on, so I won't claim to be an expert there at all. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, and I believe we are running really over time. If we started 5 minutes late, we will finish 5 minutes late. So Shiva, you have the floor.
Okay, as a question to Larry, and so American government is known for the support that it gives to business. And for example, in former governments, whenever there was a high-level delegation, even if it was at the level of a president's delegation to a country like Japan, trade issues related to automobile sector were taken up by government, and government supports business to that extent. When internet was invented, why didn't you think of a system whereby it becomes an ecosystem of patents and privately owned, rigidly controlled American enterprises, and instead, why did you open it up? Why did you make it free? And why did you have a policy of making internet free and open?
Larry.
It's a very good question. I wasn't there at the time. I've gone back and looked at the documents from that period, in particular the white paper, and I think at the time there were a number of factors that were very important to the United States government when it made the announcement to have the domain name system be privatized. And one of the key questions that was raised at that time was the fact that the internet was expanding greatly internationally, that international citizens wanted to have a say in how the internet was going to run, and that was a value that was important to the United States government at that time. So there's very specific references in the policy white paper saying that they wanted to encourage international involvement in the governance of the domain name system, and that indeed part of the approach in designating ICANN to perform those functions was the notion that that organization would seriously attract international engagement in the governance of the domain name system issue. So it was a core principle of the United States in 1998.
I have the other answer.
Thank you, Larry. Vint has another answer.
There.
Vint was there.
And Bob Kahn and I actually talked about whether the design of the internet should be in any way protected. Remember, this is 1973. We're in the middle of the Cold War. We're doing a project for the U.S. Defense Department. And we come up with a solution to a technical problem. And we realize that for that solution to be widely applicable, it's going to have to become an international standard. So we decided that the best way to achieve that objective was to put no barriers on the adoption and use of this design. So we published the papers without any constraint. We published the documents in Steve's RFC series describing how to build these systems. And we didn't want the commercial sector to resist the use of non-proprietary protocols, using the excuse that they would have to license them and therefore were uninterested in implementing them. And to be frank, when you think about the military use of communication technology, you can never tell in the future who will be your friends and who will be your enemies, and you want to be able to communicate with your friends. And so since you don't know which is which, you need to be able to communicate with everybody. That's why we didn't put any patents or copyrights on the original documentation.
Thank you very much, Vin. So clearly there are more questions, I think, in the queue, and I also had a question myself, which was the current stress there is between having an internet that is following those core values, but that also requires other components which might clash with those core values in order to be sustainable. For example, the economics of collecting data is actually one of the core principles for providing free services. Okay, the contrast between privacy and transparency and the contrast of all of these issues. I think we'll probably have to touch on these the next time we meet, which hopefully will be next year. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for having been in this small, very hot room. Thanks very much. It's really been great to listen to you and to have your wisdom. And I'd like to thank, of course, our audience and transcribers and the technical crew. And this meeting is therefore adjourned.